much. Well, it's a great pleasure to be back again. I think it was almost exactly 2 years ago that we were here talking on this subject, Imperial court costume, as Louise said, of the Qing dynasty. That's the last of the dynasties, 1644 through till 1911. And what we did on that particular occasion was to concentrate on insignia of rank. So these were the aspects of the court costume that determined one's rank and status within the imperial hierarchy. And the good news, I hope, is that we have to recap on that. So if you didn't hear that talk, it really doesn't matter, because we couldn't have a talk covering this topic without at least spending some time taking you through regulated court costume and then on to informal costume, which is what we want to do tonight. Now, there is just a small sample, because obviously we've had to bring these down from Scotland where we live, but just a small sample of textiles from the collection, all of which I think, with maybe a couple of exceptions, will be covered in the talk itself. So you'll see the digital image of them. I say that because I have to apologise. I got all the labels out, I clipped them up ready to come, and they're still sitting at home on the bookcase. So I do apologise. Normally there would have been an explanation by these, but as I say, we'll touch on most of them as we go through the talk tonight. Okay, it's probably quite useful to talk a little bit about the Qing dynasty and put it into some degree of historical context. As I said, it was the last of the Chinese dynasties, and it was only the second dynasty in China that was actually created by non-ethnic Chinese. The first was the Yuan dynasty under the Mongols, and this was the second, where the Manchu, which was a sort of conglomerate of tribes in northern China, the Manchurian Peninsula, who, towards the end of the Ming dynasty, rather opportunistically organised themselves and some neighbouring tribes to actually plan to seize power. And in fact, the last Ming emperor, made it incredibly easy for that to happen. The story goes that the founding fathers, as you see here, organised a massive army. They established a new capital just north of the Great Wall. And by the time that they were ready to consider seizing power, what had happened in Beijing, because of prolonged famine in China, effectively Beijing had been seized by a warlord. The emperor, it's a very bloody story, but he ended up hanging himself after murdering most of the imperial women of the court. The then incumbent warlord had a decision to make. Now, did he fight the Manchus? Or did he seek to have an allegiance with them? And he struck the sensible balance of allying himself with the Manchu, and literally the gates were open, and the Manchus established their dynasty with very little, if any, bloodshed. The young emperor here, Songji, was only 6 years old, and for the first 8 years of the dynasty, the regent, Dogon, was the effective ruler. He did a particularly good job in establishing Manchu rule across China. It took a few years, but he established their rule and amalgamated that within the Han culture of Confucian teaching, which was the basis of imperial rule and government, which we'll touch on. And then we have a glorious period in China's history. It's called the High Qing period. 3 emperors, Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, and we're going to talk quite a bit about Qianlong on and off this evening. And they took China through, as I say, a glorious period. They increased the landmass under Chinese rule by over a third. The arts, the sciences came on in incredible leaps and bounds. The economy prospered. And we'll see a few little facts that link to that in a moment. But like all things that rise to great heights, there's always a long way to fall. And towards the end of Qianlong's reign, when he was well into his 80s, he came under the influence of an exceedingly corrupt courtier, and the whole Qing dynasty slid into a slow decline towards their ultimate collapse. And you see here then a series of emperors from Zhajing onwards who were young, inexperienced, and fairly inept at being able to rule China. In fact, they were actually dealt a pretty poor hand of cards in terms of how China had found itself during this period. And we see at the bottom, if it wasn't for the Dowager Empress, who often gets a very poor press, it would be almost certain that China would have collapsed, that Western colonial powers and perhaps Japan would have torn China apart at a much earlier date than, well, it didn't really at all, but she became the effective emperor of China in 1862. Now, there's a few facts from the period itself which I think illustrates how the success, certainly in the early period. During this period, with the massive expanse, particularly under Qianlong, China became the 5th largest empire the world has ever seen. It basically covered 4.6 million square miles. As I said earlier, that's a third greater than when the Ming were ruling. It compares actually quite favourably with the extent of China's borders today, and it is almost exactly, that's almost exactly the same as the USA, 3.6 million square miles. What that doesn't tell you, though, is that surrounding China, countries like Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, Burma, up through Nepal and Bhutan, was what is known as tribute countries. And under the tribute system, whatever fashion their monarchy or method of rule dictated, those leaders pledged their absolute undying support to the Chinese emperor. So the landmass over which particularly Qianlong ruled was much bigger than the 4.6 million square miles. The population from the beginning of the dynasty to the end increased from 150 million to 450 million. Incredible increase in population. And that was a population that had to be successfully fed. And what you see during this period is incredible progress in terms of taking land into arable production. There was a price to pay because the problems of soil erosion really dates its way back to that particular time. But in the middle of the reign, it was a highly successful policy. In 1790, I think this is one of the most strangest of statistics, that China produced a third of the world's goods and products in terms of goods and services in terms of value. What that doesn't tell you is that China, as an importer of goods, excluding opium, which I know we can't, but for legitimate imports, had a very small amount of importation coming into the country. So what you see here is a huge volume of exports, predominantly to Europe, and that becomes the root cause of the ultimate collapse of the Qing dynasty itself. Home for the imperial family was the Forbidden City. The Forbidden City was contained within the inner city of Beijing itself, which was linked with the outer city, 22 square miles. Within the inner city, you had the imperial city. Within the imperial city, you had the Forbidden City. The imperial city was about 2 square miles, whereas the Forbidden City was about 3/4 of a square mile. All protected by high, thick walls, and in the case of the Forbidden City, with a large, deep moat. The construction of the Forbidden City, again, it is an outer and an inner design. The outer area is really where the emperor interacted with his government. He interacted with visitors to the court from overseas. But the inner area here was reserved exclusively for the imperial family, the immediate imperial family. So first-rank princes and princesses, and only people who were directly responsible for the day-to-day care of the emperor and his immediate family were allowed to be active in this back area, or this inner area of the Forbidden City. Here we see, this is the Meridian Gate leading into the Forbidden City, 2 guardhouses here, and down here would be Tiananmen Square. Here are the great halls of state, supreme harmony, then you have preserving harmony here. Here's a couple of photos which are very recognisable from the Forbidden City. Here's one of these great open plazas which could accommodate thousands, and often did, people coming to pay tribute to the emperor. An artificial river. Here's a bridge that runs down to the centre, which is the gate here of Supreme Harmony. The Hall of Supreme Harmony is the roof here, but this passage was only reserved for the emperor to travel down. And if we look behind that, this is the most senior of state halls, the Hall of Preserving Harmony. And in each of these halls of government, you would have a throne area, wonderful excuse me, wonderful decorations, and you would see the full court regalia around the throne itself. But we're here to talk about textiles tonight. That's a little bit of a potted history. And I normally focus the talk on the Emperor Qianlong himself. Qianlong was arguably one of the greatest of the Chinese emperors. He ruled from 1736 till 1795. He was unusual because he then decided to abdicate, and he fulfilled a promise to his grandfather, the Emperor Kangxi, that he wouldn't rule a day longer than his grandfather had actually been on the throne. So he stepped down, but human nature being what it is, he didn't truly relinquish power, obviously, until he died in 1799. We see him in his full court regalia here. We're going to deconstruct that as we go through this evening, but here at the age of 24, Qianlong was it's his accession to the imperial throne. We see him in the Chao Pao, which is the most formal, senior of the state robes. And as I say, we'll point out other constituent parts of this outfit which could leave you in no doubt that the person we're looking at has to be the emperor himself. Next we see a portrait, both by the same artist, but you notice this is a very European style portrait. As far as we know, it is the first time that we've seen an emperor on horseback in a very typical Napoleonic type of portraiture. And part of the reason for this is that both of these paintings were actually painted by a Jesuit priest. Giuseppe Castiglione came to China in the 1720s. He operated at the court of his father, the Emperor Yongzheng, and as many Jesuit priests had found, they were welcome at the court as long as they brought a skill, a scientific skill or an artistic skill with them. And Castiglione became famous throughout China, and I think probably well beyond China, for his portraits of the royal family and also of the great records on massive scrolls of special events during this particular period. And that probably explains why you see Qianlong in his full ceremonial armour here on one of his periodic inspections of his troops. But for us, for anyone interested in the area of imperial court costume, Qianlong was particularly important because when he came to power, he had a fantastic work ethic. He was legendary for the amount of poetry he wrote, for the amount of literature he produced. He was possibly one of the greatest fine art collectors the world has ever seen. But he was a traditionalist. He wanted to preserve his Manchu culture, but at the same time he realised that it was almost impossible to ignore the fact that, I don't know what the ratio was, but I think the Manchus formed about 2% of the overall population in China at that particular time. He needed the support of the Han Chinese, the gentry of the time, the officials of the time, who would all have been studied and been brought up on Confucian-based teaching. One of his cultural projects, and there were many of them, but one of them in 1759 was the Huangchao Liqi Tushi, which was a project where the emperor gathered together the hundreds, if not thousands, of imperial edicts that were issued to tell people exactly what they had to wear, on what particular occasion, at what time of the year, and for what particular function. And we'll see its scope in a minute. All you really need to understand from this is that having gathered these things all together, that in itself was a massive project. But Qianlong was not satisfied with this. What he needed to do was to obviously remove the obsolete. He wanted to build upon those aspects where he felt greater clarification was needed. And then he went about a considerable amount of innovation. A few of those innovations we'll see today. So this was the last time that imperial costume was ever considered in this way in imperial ruled China. And as I said, what really stands out as an illustration, I guess, of the complexity is that the finished product was 18 volumes, in excess of 5,000 pages of descriptive text, and over 6,000 hand-painted illustrations. This is a remarkably small amount of descriptive text, but these are the type of illustrations that were produced for robes, dress accessories, anything that fell within the scope of the regulations themselves. It took a remarkably short time to complete. It was finished in 1762, and what a great shame. Today, it doesn't exist as a centralised reference point. Because unfortunately, the main version of this was housed at the Summer Palace, and in 1860, it was partly destroyed, partly looted. You see pages of this. The V&A very proudly have a number of pages in their collection, and you see it scattered around the world in private collections. And what you don't have is you don't have the complete records. And so, in this particular area, even with the court regulations, we're still kind of guessing at exactly what was supposed to happen. A few more illustrations from those regulations. The system itself, it covered the emperor and the empress, of course. The direct sons of the emperor. It went through the 4 ranks of princes, the 4 ranks of imperial dukes, and then the 4 ranks of other levels of nobility. Mostly Manchu, but not all Manchu. Sometimes there were Han nobility who had been promoted into the hierarchy. 12 ranks of the imperial family, and then in parallel to that you have the 9 ranks of civil officials, and you have the 9 ranks of military officials. We're going to touch on all that, but you know, it was a vast amount of coverage. And as I said, it covered the time of year because there were distinct differences between winter and summer. There was clothing required only for ceremonial occasions, special sacrifices, mainly for the production of food. And then there was the whole area of semi-formal regulated costume. But we'll go through that in a wee bit more detail in a moment. The indications of imperial status, there was a number of them. They weren't all exclusive to the emperor, but they were utilised in a variety of ways and changed in a variety of ways in order to establish the rank and status of the wearer. Probably the most important and the one we're most familiar with is the dragon itself. A mythological creature, a benign creature, and in Chinese mythology it represented a creature who woke from the winter from the winter hibernation. At the spring solstice, it came from the celestial mountain, it went down to the sea to feed, and once it had fed, it then took control basically of the weather. It's an interesting concept in itself. Primarily, the dragon was controlling the rains that would come to sustain the crops, that would produce the harvest, that would feed the people. So taking the image of the dragon and applying it to the emperor makes perfect sense, because one of the prime responsibilities of the emperor was to feed his people. And he spent a lot of the calendar year fulfilling those obligations at various ceremonies and rituals. We see the circle. The circle is a representation of heaven, the universe. The emperor was the son of heaven. And what we're seeing here is that the circle itself would encompass imagery that portrayed membership of those highest levels of the imperial structure. So that we have the dragon roundels, as you see here. Colour. Colour was particularly important. The universe, the Chinese universe as they saw it, were made up of various constituent parts. When it came to colour, there were 5 colours. And the central colour was yellow, imperial yellow. Yellow was the colour of the Qing dynasty, but that doesn't matter. The imperial yellow that we know predated that and was associated exclusively with the emperor. All other colours that were acquired through regulated costume were derived from that imperial yellow colour. We'll see some examples, but if you go on the male side, you will go through deeper golden yellow into brown, into blue, and into blue-black. If you go down the female side, you'll go from deeper yellow into green and out through to pink. So there was a spectrum of colour, all of which denoted the status of the individual wearer. Insignia typically would have 5 clouds, all of different colours, the 5 colours representing the 5 clouds which would appear on an imperial insignia. Lesser number of colours, different colours, would obviously indicate a lower status, although very difficult to actually spot that at any sort of distance at all. And then we finish up with 12 symbols, 12 ancient symbols. And I stress the word ancient because they date back into Chinese mythology. They represent heavenly objects, they represent earthly rituals and celebrations, and they represent elements on this earth. And they were represented by certain illustrations, and these would be placed in exactly the same position as you see in this schematic here of a dragon robe. Their usage was restricted only to the emperor, and rather bizarrely, this practice never existed until 1759. So the Emperor Qianlong, in his vanity, and he was a very vain emperor, decided that he wanted yet another indication of his imperial immortal status. And so these subtle signs, and we'll see some of them deployed, was introduced. If we step down the hierarchy, just one level, this is a first-rank prince, it's Prince Yu, and he was an uncle to Qianlong, and we see him again as an ancestor portrait here in his full state regalia. The big difference from Qianlong's portrait is that we now have this plain surcoat, a chao fu, on which are emblazoned these dragon roundels. 4 roundels, 2 on the shoulders, 1 front, 1 back, establishing exactly, for reasons I'll explain in a moment, the status of the individual. Now, the portrait of the emperor in just the plain Chao Pao doesn't mean he didn't wear one of these robes. He did, on most other occasions. On his accession to the throne, he wouldn't have worn this. This would have been awarded to him after that particular ceremony. But for anyone studying, and perhaps anyone at court who needed quickly to assess the status of someone around him, these robes were absolutely priceless because they were such a clear indication. But it doesn't end there. You see the Chao Pao, and you see that shade even on this rather elderly portrait is a much deeper yellow, almost a caramel colour. You see the court necklace here. That's indicative of the rank, and we'll come back to that in a moment. The hat, the finial, again, another accessory which indicates the rank and status of the wearer. If we move right almost to the other end of the spectrum, this is a civil official, it's a mandarin of the court. And actually, when you look at the two, there aren't huge differences. From the top, we see the hat with the finial, we see his version of the court necklace, but now we see a square badge on what is known as the pufu for him, the plain blue robe, and on there you might just make out that there's a bird, and the bird would represent the rank of the individual as a civil official. If you were a military official, you would see an animal. We'll come back to that in a moment. But he wears his version of the ceremonial chow pao robe. We talked about the origin of the dragon, and here we see an example from our collection, which is in fact from the Ming dynasty. Dates from around about 1550, and in terms of the iconography, it's very typical of the period. It's a sort of profile dragon, a running dragon is sometimes described. It's a long dragon because it has 5 claws. So the number of claws, as some of you might recall, is an indicator of the status of the dragon itself. 2 horns, a rather benign looking expression, and the only other, well, this is the rock representing the earth. Here we see the waves representing the ocean, and the only other common design feature is this circle with flames around it. That's the flaming pearl. The flaming pearl represented knowledge. And so on most occasions, but not all, most occasions, you see the dragon chasing the pearl, chasing ultimate knowledge, whether they be the emperor himself or someone at a lower level. So that's a Ming dragon. This is a Qing dragon, and what strikes you immediately is that the most senior Qing dragon is the portrait dragon. He looks at you, he's more confrontational, he's thought to represent, I guess, the culture of the Manchu much better. But he now takes top position, and this particular piece is historically quite important because if you look at the structure, well, first you look at the workmanship. It can only be from the imperial silkworks themselves, just the sheer quality, the type of design that's going on in the background here. But the key feature is this longevity symbol that sits above the dragon's head. This is 10,000 times 10,000 years, wrapped up sometimes in the title of a shoe symbol, although there are a number of variants. And it was reserved for 2 people at court. One would be the emperor himself, but it would be worn front and back. For reasons I don't have time to go into, we know that this was worn on one of the shoulders. And because it was on a shoulder, because it had this symbol above the head, it could only be worn by the crown prince, the heir apparent to the Emperor Qianlong. And here we see just a little bit of a blow-up of the detail here. And what you will then notice in much more closer detail, we're not looking simply at gold couching, but there's gold and silver. And it is almost, well, there's always exceptions to prove the rule. I've not seen it before, but this sort of combination of gold and silver was reserved for the very highest levels within the imperial family. I told you the number of claws varied, and here we have a 4-clawed Mang dragon. In every other sense, it's as you would expect from the late Ming period. There's the flaming pearl. Sadly, the badge has seen a lot of years of action, and the detail has faded or disintegrated somewhat. But very much a 4-clawed dragon. If you were rank 5 and below in the imperial family, you were not entitled to wear your dragon insignia in a circle. You became, like all of us here, mortal. You removed yourself from the higher levels of the imperial family, hence the use of a square, which all other insignia occupied. And here we see an example from the Qing period. Much more colourful, much more busy, very typical for around about 1800. A much more confrontational style of dragon, reserved, as I said, for the imperial dukes. So you're looking at ranks 5 to 8 in the hierarchy. But we're back here now to 5-clawed dragons. Colour, as I mentioned, was very important. This chap's on the table here. He dates from the Kangxi period, and we know that this was highly likely to have been worn by the Emperor Kangxi on his form of that plain surcoat, called the Gung Fu for the emperor, and it was in imperial yellow. And you can get an idea of the vibrancy of the colour around the outer border of this. This roundel is split down the middle, telling us it would be on the front of the chest. I put this up because I'm indebted to the meeting I came to 2 years ago, and I talked to people. I said, you know, if you look at enough of these dragons, you will notice that dragons are cross-eyed. You will also notice the fact that, you also have to understand the fact that mistakes didn't happen. That anything that passed from the workshops went through the imperial household and the Board of Rights. The quality controls en route meant that you would not see this as an error. And if you see it enough times, then you know it's not an error. And I said, I have not read anywhere that explains. And there's a lot of things you see which is not put down in writing. Because people understand why it happened. It was common sense. We had one of these eureka moments. Someone came up to me and said, well, think about it. What's this chap doing here? What's this dragon's prime function? And it is to collect or capture the flaming pearl. And where is the pearl? Well, the pearl is front and centre. So there is absolutely no reason why he would be gazing at us, because his function, his concentration is on the flaming pearl here. Brilliant. And I've got no reason to believe that that's not a perfectly plausible explanation, and I've used it ever since. So, but you will not find it in any of the literature, both Chinese or Western, explaining this design feature. If we look at the colours for the female side, you see here a princess's roundel, and it's a little bit like the porcelains, where you have the famille vert and the famille rose. In this case, famille vert, where the insignia is designated to a high-ranking imperial princess because it's predominantly green in the background, obviously dominated by this gold-couched dragon. And you see again this longevity symbol in the middle. Now again, there are not any prescribed regulations that cover this, but we think that its use on a female insignia just indicates that this would have been produced for a birthday celebration, because this longevity symbol is obviously something that appears on a lot of birthday-related costume and textiles outside of the formal system. Just in contrast, I said the lower-ranking princesses and internoble women would be wearing, well, this was described as apricot, make of it what you will, a pink apricot sort of design. Comes from a semi-formal robe. We're side-facing, and that's what happened where side and front-facing dragons were combined on a robe, again to indicate the rank and status of the individual wearer. Most senior had all front-facing. Some, though, had a mixture of these dragons. We have two-clawed dragons. We have three-clawed dragons. The three-clawed dragon, again, is not specifically covered in the regulations, but we think because of size and structure, it's an immature dragon, it's a chi dragon, and it would have been worn by imperial children. The two-clawed dragon actually is in the regulations, and it's a rare usage which would have been bestowed by the emperor when a woman at court would have found herself either without a husband or without a father who was either dead or no longer at court, but the emperor wished to keep the woman at court. He would award her the imperial status, and her dragon, for a short period of time normally, would only have two claws on it. It's a transitional dragon. It's an adult chi dragon. But let's move on now and look at the emperor's wardrobe itself. He had the biggest of wardrobes, but it's not too far removed from what most other imperial family members and officials would have had to have considered as part of that wardrobe. We've taken a look at the formal robes for state occasions, for state ceremonies and rituals, and we'll see some examples in a moment. We then have semi-formal robes, and these are the iconic dragon robes. These are the sort of thing, they're the IBM blue suit of the period. This is what you wore on a day-to-day basis when you went to work on state matters or whatever you happen to be involved in at the court or in provincial government. Everybody had them, winter and summer versions, men and women, all the way through the hierarchy of government and the imperial family. You then had regular robes. Regular robes were reserved for the imperial family where they were in a period of either mourning for a relative, or they entered a period where they were remembering ancestors at certain times of the year, and the robes became sombre coloured. They would be silk brocade with subtle decoration on them. The colour of the silk would indicate the rank and status of the wearer. You had travelling robes. Travelling robes, because the Manchu heritage was that of a nomadic tribe who were masters of riding on horseback, that most of these costumes involved short jackets, skirts that would protect you on horseback. And these would be used for hunting trips, for many expeditions that the emperors made from Beijing all the way around their empire. So in contrast to popular belief, most of the emperors travelled extensively around their empire. And you have then the military costume. We saw that in the portrait right at the beginning. And then there was a range of informal robes, which for the men, you'll see in a moment, were rather boring and very plain. And informal robes were when you were at study, when you were reading, when you were basically relaxing and away from state matters. Here we see the formal state robe, the Chow Pao. This was an emperor's version, so now you see that vivid colour, the vivid yellow that I was talking about. It's a late variation. It's after Qianlong changed the regulations, because see the axe head here, you see the symbol here. That's 2 of the 12 symbols of imperial authority. This was a two-sectioned robe, the skirt detached from the upper part. All of the imperial family, men and women, would wear a version of this. The colour would change. And the first 4 ranks of civil officials, the first 4 ranks of military officials would also wear a variation of that. Anything lower than that, and you wore just a plain robe under the pufu with your insignia. Here, just very quickly, is the gungfu that I mentioned for the emperor. From Qianlong's reign onwards, we go to the black or blue-black silk, and on which we have the 4 roundels. That longevity symbol is above the head here. I'm sorry, I know you can't see that. But on the shoulders, what you would have is a roundel from one of those shoulders, and you see above here, this is the sun symbol. It's a 3-legged cockerel, and I did used to know the reason for that, but it obviously goes back to some story in Chinese mythology. And here is the moon symbol, which you would see on the other shoulder. It's a rabbit or a hare with a mortal or a pestle type of affair here. But they would be placed on those 2 shoulders and only worn by the emperor or the empress himself, and only worn after 1759. Here we see one of those semi-formal robes, a jifu, a long pao, a mang pao, all sorts of different names for the same article of clothing. It was worn primarily for day-to-day work. I don't show you an emperor's robe because this is a better example to actually see the positioning of the dragons. 9 dragons. 9 was a very important number. The dragon was made up of 9 different animals. The number of scales the dragon had was 9 times 9. There were 9 ranks of officials, both civil and military. So you get the idea that 9 is a very important number. Here we see the placement of these dragons. 1, 2, 3, 4. 3 on the back makes 8. And the 9th one would always be found under the inner flap, not displayed on the outer part of the robe. But there would always be, on a genuine robe of this period, there would be 9 dragons for this senior level. Brown would indicate that this was a 3rd or 4th rank prince that was wearing this particular robe. Just in terms of structure, this again was another Qianlong innovation. Well, this stripy bit, the Lui Shui, is in fact calm water below these turbulent wave tops. That's all that signifies. But again, it helps us date these textiles, which is very useful on occasions. Hats, as I said, a hat was very distinguishable by the rank of the wearer. Here we see just a little extract from the regulations, and we see a winter hat for the emperor. This is red silk floss. You see the finial here, gold and pearls, indicative of imperial or the emperor's status, and this would be sable fur. And it won't come as a surprise from what I've said earlier that the type of fur that you could wear as an imperial family member for regulated costume was covered also by the regulations. So the first 5 ranks of officials, they also could wear designated type of fur. Below that, you were not permitted to do so. This is the court necklace. Do you remember the portraits that we looked at earlier on? Most of them were wearing this long necklace, the jiaozu. In terms of its construction, identical. Every single one was identical. 108 beads, 4 dividing plaques, 3 counting strings, and a counterweight string. The thing that distinguished the status of the wearer was actually the materials that were used to construct the necklace. In this particular case, for the emperor, it would have been jade, coral, and pearls that made up the constituent parts of the court necklace. Robes had no pockets, and so what you used to have was a belt or a chow dai, from which, in this particular case, these are ceremonial belt hangings. What we'll see a little later on is this is an art form in itself. Thousands of different designs, dozens of different purposes, and we'll see a selection of those, and there are some on the table, all of which would have been hung from the belt. But this is a ceremonial belt to go on a chow dai. Boots and shoes for the men. Well, the distinguishing characteristic is that you had to be right at the top of the imperial hierarchy to wear boots. Very few in China during this period of time had the ability or the financial resources to have boots. The shoes are quite similar to shoes you would find on that men used to wear at the time, thick felted soles, a little bit of decoration, but of course we know it's the emperor's boots because of this yellow silk in the main body of the leg section. As I said, informal wear was rather boring. Here we see, there used to be an ensemble, basically the long plain robe. Obviously the silk, the colour of the silk would designate the status of the wearer, but the naitao was often worn on its own. This is fur-lined. There's fur on the edges here, which again would be a distinguishing mark as to the status of the wearer. Obviously the emperor would wear a bright yellow version of this. It would often be worn with a 3/4 length tunic top, called a weitao, and then you'd have a reinforced collar. And here we see a photograph of an incredibly important member of the imperial family in the second half of the 19th century. This is Prince Gong. He acted as the go-between. After the sacking and the burning of the Summer Palace in 1860, he was the one that negotiated the ultimate peace treaty. He went to and from the imperial family. The court had fled Beijing to north of the Great Wall, and he negotiated a treaty with the Western powers, particularly with France and Britain. He spoke 5 different languages, 4 different European languages, and he set up the first foreign language school in China. So he had a strong Western leanings, and this explains why a member of the imperial family would ever let themselves be photographed. It was extremely rare. And look how relaxed he is. He wears no hat. There's no real indication of the status of this particular individual. There's the reinforced collar, there's the naitao, and then another plain robe underneath. And that's what tended to happen with informal clothing. It was based on layers. You might have a pair of silk trousers right underneath, but according to the temperature, you just layered up to cope with the cope with the climate. If we move now through to the officials, here we see a military official. Here's his rank badge, 12 inches squared, typically. And there's an animal on there, you'll have to take my word for it. But look at the construction. It's exactly what we saw in the earlier portraits. There is Chow Pao, so we know he's a 4th rank and above. There's the necklace, there's the hat, there's the finial. And the only new item of clothing here that you see is the eyed peacock feather. And this was a reward from the emperor himself. If you happened to be in the first 5 ranks of civil officials, you had a 1-eyed feather. If you were below that, so 6 to 9, you had a plain peacock feather. If you were a prince, you had a 3-eyed feather. And what am I left with? A 2-eyed feather, which would be for the imperial dukes. So again, there was a hierarchy to these. It wasn't the quality of the services to the court that determined the number of eyes that you had on the feather. And here we see reality. So we see a black and white photograph, which really doesn't do the costume much justice. But again, we think it's a civil official. Can't quite, I think that's a bird there. Necklace, plains. We know now there's this ranks 5 to 9. You see the rather thick-soled shoes that he wears, and the plain, the pufu with the badge itself. Now, we haven't got time, and it's a completely separate lecture to talk about the examination process by which you became particularly a civil official. Military officials were nowhere near as important from an examination point of view. But once you graduated through this incredibly long and torturous examination process, you would eventually be graded. The 0.5% of students that made it to the palace examination, so you went provincial, metropolitan, palace examination, that made it and was graded, then costume became an integral part of your life. And here we see a 1st rank robe, blue robe with silver trim, dates from around about 1900. Hat finials became important because this was the life that the graduate had to face when he went into the civil service. This is a 1st rank finial. You see here the eagle representing knowledge. You see the ruby here, which is indicative of 1st rank. And here we see a very nice photograph of a young graduate in his full robe, the blue robe with the silver trim. There's a red sash here, a big peeling collar. Rather strange double finial effect, but it is this. And then a very proud father standing next to his son, who also happens to be a civil official. And from then on, your life became one of being, according to the grading, your position, your rank from the exams, you were positioned within then the 18 grades, because the 9 levels were split into two, an A and a B. Every 3 years you took more exams, you got a testimonial from the person you worked for, you may be transferred around the country, and you rose, and as you rose, well, you didn't always rise, but those that rose, more and more power, more and more wealth would be derived. This is the gentry of China at that particular point in time. A very powerful body, and predominantly Han Chinese, not Manchu Chinese. Rank, as I talked about last time, the 9 ranks were portrayed by 9 different birds. We're not going to go through each one of them, but you see here the crane, golden pheasant, peacock, goose, silver pheasant, egret, mandarin duck, quail, paradise flycatcher. We just have gone through them now. But we're not going to see examples of all of them, we haven't got time. But this is a particularly nice badge, very typical of the Kangxi period, when it was very much the vogue to have this gold-couched background. Sadly, this doesn't come from our collection. It's owned by a friend of ours in Hong Kong. Very stylized crane at the 1st rank. We know it's a crane because of the skull cap here. But the rock, the waves, the clouds, everything that you would have seen in the dragon roundels and squares, you see in the structure here. Only difference is this disc in the sky. And I'm sure everyone in the room here would agree that that must be the sun. And that's There's some academic debate as to what this represents, but it's a circle. It represents the emperor because it is a circle. It's the sun in the sky. And if you look at the animals and birds, they look lovingly up and respectfully up to the emperor. And that is the widely held theory. But it's not in the regulations. It started at the beginning of the Qing dynasty. It was never, as far as we know, documented. Here's a couple of other examples of rank badges at different periods, about 1830. This is a Mandarin duck. You can tell this by the shape of the neck feathers and the body itself. And here we see an example which is here tonight of a statement badge. And I call it that because if you get a chance to look closely at this, it's a whole flurry of activity. In fact, the bird itself almost gets lost in the colour of the background itself and all these symbolic plants that we see. But if you look closely, the person who commissioned this has ensured that the embroiderer has put gold couching around all of the detail of the badge itself. That would have increased significantly the time to construct the badge and therefore the cost. So he's making a lot of these badges also make statements as to the wealth of the individual wearer. The military was very much the same, organised on the 9 levels. The examination process was based on physical attributes. So there were tests of strength, skill, accuracy with a bow and sword. They're a mixture of, obviously, mythological animals, but even the animals who we would recognise the name of, in terms of their construction, they're not familiar to us. You wouldn't immediately recognise the bear and the lion as being an accurate representation. Here we have a first rank, Qilin, and you have here a 3 combination: a dragon's head, a body of a deer, and in Chinese design, this is a bear's tail. The rankings as far as footwear goes is that claws are more senior to hooves, which are more senior to paws. So that's how you work out the listing as you see here. And here we see a 6th rank panther, again a statement badge, because in the middle of the 19th century there was a move back to rather this ostentatious portrayal with the gold background. When you've got a golden coloured animal, it kind of gets lost in that background, but that's what was going on here. And again, it was a message to the people viewing this badge that the person who commissioned it had a lot of wealth and therefore probably a lot of power. The robes of the time, this is the semi-formal dragon robe, a mangpao, 5 dragons. This is an unusual robe. It's owned by a friend of ours in Hong Kong. We know it's a 7th rank official. You see the lesser number of dragons here, and if you're very eagle-eyed, you might spot that the dragon here has caught the pearl. And inside this robe, there's a kind of history. It's owned, or was owned, by the Imperial Wardrobe Estate Music, and it was produced for the exclusive use of the chief musician at the time. So one can speculate with a fair degree of confidence that this was a special award from the emperor for services to music. So when you see dragons having caught the pearl, it would have been an award, and it would have been an award for scientific or achievements in the field of the arts. Hats, as we've talked about, again, denoted by the finials, the rank of the wearer. Here's some of those peacock feathers. There's one-eyed and there's a blank peacock feather. This is a summer hat. So the summer hats reflected the climate. They were bamboo, dyed yak's hair, much lighter and easier to wear. So now we have, just to finish off, this is a Qianlong innovation because he realised that his officials wearing these ceremonial finials, big, tall, cumbersome things, was not really, it was a bit of a burden for them. So he came up with, with these, which are affectionately known as Mandarin buttons, and as you can see on these hats, they're much more practical. They'd be worn on a day-to-day basis when you're travelling around without the risk of your hat sort of flipping off or having to be strapped on. Now, in formal dress, as we move, what we're going to do is we'll come in and out of the court, but this also encompasses people who fulfill the upper or fill the upper echelons of Chinese society at the time. And so these were wealthy landowners, they might be merchants, but they were important people of the time. And here we see some informal wear, this elderly gentleman. And one of the important things, and you'll see this on a few examples I've got here, is that most of this clothing doesn't appear to fit. Okay? And the whole purpose of clothing such as this, the more voluminous, the more I spent on it. And where you didn't have exotic designs, as you do with insignia, to illustrate how much wealth and influence you had, then you often found the robes, both men and women, were extremely voluminous. And that was the message. Silk, even though China had a monopoly almost on silk, remained very expensive. It was such a powerful export that it was equally expensive to be bought internally within China. So this gentleman here has a fairly voluminous natal, and here we see a couple of groupings here. This has got to be the worst fitting robe I've ever seen. There is no reason for the sleeves to be that long, because if you look at these two smart young chaps here, the sleeves are of a correct length. It's too short, he shouldn't be flashing his ankles in the way, but this is a Han family group, and again, I don't know, maybe it's just simply because these robes are sort of big, but they certainly weren't built for it. Decorative robes, male and female, were where you didn't pass on your robes as an imperial family member or as an official, but your informal wear you often passed on as part of an inheritance, or you found that there were the Mossbros equivalent in China. You could rent robes, not so much for this type of informal wear, but for family weddings where you wanted decorated robes, but you couldn't afford or didn't want to afford all of the cost of producing them. Mm-hmm.
Are those
yes, they are.
feet shoes?
Yes,
okay,
they are. I was going to point that out in a minute, but you're exactly right. I was going to sound very smart and say, but we know that this is a Han family group here. And the reason we know that is because the elderly lady sitting on the step has bound feet shoes.
Yes.
And as we'll finish off with tonight, we'll learn that the Manchu women of the ruling class never bound their feet. This was a practice that was exclusive to the Han Chinese and had been for 1,500 years, well, 1,000 years. And here, just to finish it off, we see these two smart young gentlemen here in their most smart casual wear. You see the three-quarter length jackets now, and the long robes, the natal, waitao, reinforced collar, and then they have the melon skull cap on the top. And these are sort of hats that were typical of the sort of period. Folded down, you got it in a little packet, you went to a special shop to buy them. And here you have a winter version. Now I did say that, of course, you were not allowed to wear fur. This is rabbit fur. It didn't, as long as the fur that you wore didn't actually sit within the prescribed list for the imperial family and the officials, it didn't matter what you used. So anything that was available. And for anyone that's been to Beijing in the winter, it gets cold. You need that sort of protection. Here we see typical men's shoes of the time, lacking in decoration, but for a normal shaped foot. Now you might say, I'm just going to go on a tangent, you might say, of course, for man's shoe, you wouldn't have issues with bound feet. Well, in fact, there was a group of boys who did have their feet bound, because in Chinese opera, you were not allowed to use women in the opera, so you had to use young boys, and there are examples, photographs of boys that would have also had their feet bound at the time to fulfill their role for a limited period of time, I would think, in the Chinese opera. This is a unisex piece of clothing. It's a bamboo vest. I have no idea whether it's uncomfortable or not. It doesn't look very comfortable. It would have been worn in summer, and its prime purpose would be to lift the silk from the skin. So it's designed to reduce sweat damage, which would obviously wreak havoc on an expensive robe. And it's a very popular tourist piece. They've been churned out in their thousands, and you see them in the markets purporting to be mid to late 19th century, but invariably they're about 2 weeks old. Now you remember a time ago I mentioned about the belt and the belt hangings, and just to give you a flavour here of the diversity that one sees. Now, the giving of purses and belt hangings was a tradition from the emperor downwards at the Lunar New Year, so the Chinese New Year, giving gifts, often with money tucked inside. These are just a representative sample. You would not only, in big cities, you would not just find one manufacturer, you'd find a whole street dedicated just to producing belt hangings, as you would sleeve panels and collars. But here we have a selection, so what have we got here? These are fragrance purses, these are for spectacles, it's a kerchief, that's for a little chop or a seal. Chopsticks, paintbrushes or fans would go in these long, slender containers. Here we have a matched pair of, which on closer examination almost is a sort of microcosm of a dragon robe in terms of the features that it incorporates. And here we have some other purposes, again another fragrance purse. Look at the diversity of designs. They could be quite futuristic, they could refer to the imperial rule, they could refer to stories, and here's a sort of naturalistic scene. This is a tobacco purse here, or a snuff bottle could be placed inside this particular one. This, there's another example on the table, but this is for a pocket watch. So the watch face would sit in this, and it would just flip over the belt itself. So absolute mass of different examples of this, and a strong collecting area. Okay, we're going to finish with considering the women of the court. We've already considered them in a reasonable amount of detail. The women, the princesses, and the wives of officials were completely encompassed within the court regulations. As soon as they appeared in public with their husbands, they had to match their costume. Here we see the young empress to the Emperor Tianlong on his painted at the same time as his accession to the throne in 1736. And we see, well, it's better to look at this example, because there's the chow pao. You see the darker brown robe, and the unique piece of costume for the women was this outer robe, sleeveless vest, called a chow kao, and you have vertical dragons on. So none of the plain surcoat with the roundels, you wouldn't find that with the women. Instead, you have this outer vest type affair that went over the state robes themselves. And then you have the various ribbons and banners, court necklaces, hats, finials, all distinctive to the particular rank that you happen to be. This is a first-rank princess's or consort's hat, which is almost identical to the empress. You have 9 phoenixes around the base here in gold and pearls, and then you have a stack of dragons, which if you look at it a little bit closer, here you see the gold dragons. It's not the same as this one, but and this is the pearls that have been embellished onto the finial itself. And here, from the back, with semi-precious stones, you would hang a ribbon both front and back, with dragons and phoenixes. What happened with the semi-formal robes? This is a dragon robe, or semi-formal robe, for a woman, and for a considerable period after the change in the regulations. We saw the man's robe with a dragon here, dragons there, dragons on the shoulder. Well, the women actually retained an older style of robe, and we haven't got time, but there is a well-defined progression into the male version of the robe. But it does mean that you find these roundels being utilised for a much longer period. And so women's roundels are easier to come by than their male versions. Although it's quite problematical to sort of identify the sex of the roundel at any particular time. But that explains why there are good supply. Again, at a semi-formal level, and this kind of reflects the Manchu background. This is a 3/4 length and Mang-Al jacket, very practical for the purposes of riding on horseback. This is a marriage jacket, by the way. It incorporates dragons, but it's in this distinctive red colour, which would indicate a wedding ceremony. Under all of the robes, most of the time, you would find the 18-panelled skirts. This again is a marriage skirt, and rarely would you actually see these, but these panels would alternate between the dragon, representing the emperor, and the phoenix, representing the empress. The phoenix as a bird, or the feng bird, is not an insignia bird. It represents the empress, and on most occasions only appears alongside a dragon itself. Here's another version of the 18-panelled skirt, but this time it incorporates flowers which are appropriate to the particular season of the year. We'll touch on that in a moment. Underneath that, you'd probably have silk trousers or another plain silk robe, and you'd wear a silk vest type of affair called a doudou on the top. When we look at the officials, again, as I said with the imperial family, if a wife appeared in the same occasion as a husband, and here we have two wives, this is the senior wife, she's wearing this affair here called the chair pipe, and on it would be applied the badge. So again, you're having the dragon design, sleeveless vest, and then you have your husband's rank badge. And the only difference being, and I don't have a slide that really illustrates it, but you notice the sun symbol. If husband and wife were standing together, the two sun symbols would come to the centre as a mark of respect to the emperor itself. It's synergy, it's balance. If the emperor was standing in the middle of the two of them, then the sun, which represented him, would come to the centre. It wouldn't be opposing directions. Collars. Collars are a collecting area for some people, and there are almost as many different designs of collar as there are for purses and sleeve panels. They were fully detachable, so on came one collar, off came another, and they had all various purposes. This is a much bigger version of a lobed collar here, and again, seasonal flowers on this particular one, but you could really have any sort of design that you felt was appropriate, because there were no regulations that were controlling you in the wearing of this type of dress accessory. We can't talk about women's fashion at this particular time and not talk about the Dowager Empress Shichi. She was, for all of her faults, for all the other things she got up to, she was a fashion icon of the time. She loved clothing. She was also quite unique because here for the first time, well, history is part of that, but she loved, as you see here, to have herself photographed. Unheard of. And at the time, it was the shock and horror of inviting a Western photographer in to the imperial court to take photographs. But she loved to be photographed in a full finery. She realised, as a woman of a certain age, though some of her fashion designs were not totally appropriate for her to wear, but she had an army of ladies-in-waiting and princesses who did as they were told, and they would wear costume designed primarily by the Dowager Empress. And you see here, you see the decorated Manchu shoes here. We'll see some examples just in a moment. These are Narcissi design. You see the shoe symbol design, longevity symbol here. And this is pretty close to the robe that she was actually wearing. Spectacular mix of colours and design. Significant, the flowers, but not in a sense of the hierarchy. They have a certain meaning. She wears the funny batwing hat, and it's a real challenge in itself. You may just see the long fingernails here with the nail protectors. All of indications that this person never did any physical work, never needed to do physical work. And a lot to do with the shoes is about that. There were differences in structure between Han and Manchu robes. This doesn't show it as starkly as it sometimes appears. These are both, will be both wedding robes. The red colour here. The association, the use of that stylized crane indicates either that this is a high-ranking member of the imperial family, because the crane represented learning and knowledge as well as high as the first rank, or it was the wife of a first-rank official wearing this robe. Designed very much like an informal dragon robe or a jifu. And here we see a different design, which is very typical of a Han lady's robe, where you see much more frequently the use of coordinated sleeve panels. You see the robe trim here, all relating to a particular subject, where these are ships and trade, and then the collar here also, all coordinated. And this robe then could be almost dismantled and used for other purposes with different trim and different collar and so on and so forth. This was a design much favoured by the Dowager Empress. It's the forerunner of the Cheongsam that you would see in the 1920s in places like Shanghai, and it reflected the seasonal flowers. Now, I'm learning as we go along. I'm in communication at the moment with a chap who's writing a book in Beijing at the moment. It's Chinese, and he claims that there is a lot of literature which says that not only are there animals like dragons and there are birds and mythical animals for military officials, but for women there was a hierarchy on the use of flowers that goes way beyond the 4 seasons. All I have here are the 4 seasons, and the regulations prescribe that if a woman was wearing at court a costume that incorporated flowers, then these are the flowers that can only be worn at this particular season. The plum blossom, the peony, the lotus, and then the chrysanthemum in autumn. And you see these robes with sleeve panels and the body of the robe all decorated in a very similar fashion. Sleeve panels, again, an industry in itself, extremely diverse. Here's a pair that's on the table tonight. It caught my eye because one would assume that these are all Chinese junks, but they're not. There's actually a steamship there. And again, it probably indicates an official's wife who the official had something to do with customs and excise, or maybe it might be a leading trader in Canton, which was the majority of the time the only open treaty port. Here's a very different design. It incorporates elements of rank and status. So here's the golden pheasant, and there are other birds. Here's the paradise flycatcher. You see the everlasting knot, the Buddhist symbol. And someone's gone along to the workshop and described what they want, and they produced it for the person. And here's a recycled textile, because the trim of the robe, the 2 panels here, which tells a story from Chinese opera, have been incorporated into a tabletop, probably in the 1920s and the 1930s, but it's had the effect of preserving these textiles together, but they started out life having a very different function. These are some containers which are very specific to women. There's a hand warmer, which I think is here today. Here's these cute little earmuffs, and you see the rabbit the rabbit fur. There's just a little bit of remain that you can see on there, all decorated again to your specification. A small pair of spectacles, and then these rather lovely sort of presentation cases for letters or calling cards. There's a story there, and you see this wonderful peacock, which is very typical of southern Chinese embroidery. And here you see the li shi. Well, this is the red holder where you gave money to a bride and groom. It's the same as the Lunar New Year, where you have the lychee packets which you give to, you're supposed to give to unmarried women and young children, with money in them. Okay, before we get to shoes, just want to touch on kingfisher feather. In the mid to late 19th century, the majority of affordable jewellery worn on an informal basis had some degree of kingfisher feather embellished onto the metal structure. And here you see a variety of these sort of headband. You see hairpins. You see pierced ears. Ears typically had three piercings. And here you see a combined set with semi-precious stones and pearls, but incorporating the kingfisher feather. And that's one of those incredible batwing hats with a set of jewellery on it. There's a metal bar here which helps the balance, but it must have been an incredible challenge to wear one of these, because this is a tiny area. And that's it. We've had a sort of glimpse and a bit of a rummage through the wardrobe. It's extensive, both from a regulated point of view and also from an informal point of view. And I always show this slide at the end because to me it typifies why the subject, to me anyway, is so interesting. You have a wonderful ancestor portrait here. Some of you may have seen it if you were at the last talk. Look at the skill in the outer design here. They've thrown everything at it. The outfits are perfect in their construction, and yet where are the faces? You can just about make out these ghost-like faces. The chap looks like he's still got the price tag on his hat. That's obviously a peacock feather. And the point I'm trying to make is that, for all of the accepted knowledge in the subject, there are always masses of things you don't understand what happened or why. Because why would someone, a group of relatives, commission a portrait of such calibre and quality and it never be finished? We won't know. We can guess, and that's to me that's the beauty of the subject. So, thank you very much. I apologise for the slight pause in the middle. More questions?
The transitional dragon with the two claws.
Yes.
Is that only on women's robes, or did men have a transitional animal as well?
No. As far as we know, not. The regulations only deal with the two-clawed dragon specifically for the use of a lower-ranking princess or consort who had been given permission to wear this. It was felt to be a sort of, because it used the immature dragon, it was a person in transition. So the message is, you're going to get married, otherwise you're not going to be remaining at court. So you will be allied then to a male member, and you'll immediately take on his status. So as far as we know, no, it's never used in that. And I've only ever seen two or three examples, and we were lucky enough to acquire one. But as I say, and we heard someone, didn't we, on a very eminent person in the field of all things Chinese saying, well, there only ever was 5 and 4-clawed dragons. Well, that's clearly not true, because once you get, there's hooved dragons. We didn't even talk about hooved dragons. I mean, they were utilised for if you were unfortunate enough not to be born of the Manchu bloodline, but you were elevated to the nobility, in order to segregate you out as not being of the pure blood, then your dragon had a hoof, which wasn't too bad. I mean, it could have had a paw. There was still a hierarchy, but they couldn't bring themselves for you to wear the exact regalia of the Manchu family.
The devil dragon.
Any more questions? Okay, well, that's just
Thank you.
fine.
Thank you
very much.